Joan Harper sat in her garden, the only place where she felt truly at peace. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds were her only companions now. At 65, Joan had chosen to retreat from the world, a stark contrast to the vibrant, community-focused life she once led. For decades, Joan had been a cornerstone of her small town. As the town's librarian, she knew nearly everyone. From the children she guided through their first chapter books, to the retirees who sought her recommendations for historical novels. She hosted book clubs, organized charity drives, and was the first to volunteer at community events. People admired Joan for her kindness and warmth, a woman who always seemed to have her life perfectly together. But that was before the email. 2 years earlier, Joan's life appeared idyllic. Her marriage to Richard, her husband of 35 years, seemed steady. They weren't the overly affectionate type, but there was comfort in their routine. Shared dinners, quiet evenings watching old movies, and long walks through the park. Their 2 grown children, Laura and Ben, often called to check in, reinforcing the image of a happy family. Yet, beneath the surface, Joan had begun to sense a shift. Richard, once attentive and predictable, had become more distant. He often lingered on his laptop late at night, muttering something about work deadlines. His phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now constantly by his side, the screen facing down. Joan tried to push away the unease creeping into her thoughts, convincing herself that she was overthinking. "Richard's just busy," she told herself. "He'd never hurt me." The doubts began to grow one unassuming night. Richard had gone to bed early, and Joan found herself restless. She decided to tidy up the living room, where Richard's laptop was still open on the coffee table. She walked past it, intending to leave it alone, but a notification on the screen caught her eye. A new email with a subject line that made her stomach twist. Last night was unforgettable. Joan froze, her heart pounding. Don't jump to conclusions, she thought, but the temptation was too strong. With trembling hands, she clicked on the email. The words that appeared before her changed everything. The message was from someone named Lila. The tone was casual but intimate, describing details of a dinner and a hotel room. Joan's breath caught as she read, "I can't stop thinking about you. When can we see each other again?" Her hands shook as she scrolled further, finding a chain of emails stretching back months. Each message painted a picture of a relationship that was far more than professional. Dinner reservations, weekend getaways, even inside jokes. Richard had shared pieces of himself with this woman that he hadn't shared with Joan in years. Joan felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. The man she had trusted, the man she had built her life with, was living a double life. Tears blurred her vision as she slammed the laptop shut, her mind racing with anger, disbelief, and pain. Joan barely slept that night. She replayed every moment of the past year in her mind, searching for signs she might have missed. The late nights at work, the sudden attention to his appearance, the unexplained phone calls. All of it now seemed glaringly obvious. When morning came, Joan was waiting for Richard in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands clutching a cup of cold coffee. Richard entered, cheerful and oblivious. "Good morning," he said, reaching for the kettle. Joan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Who is Lila?" Richard froze, the kettle in his hand. For a moment, he looked at her as though she had spoken a foreign language. Then, realization dawned, and his face drained of color. "Joan, he stammered. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "I read the emails. How long has this been going on?" Richard set the kettle down, his hands shaking. 6 months, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's over now. Joan, I swear, it's over." The weight of his words hit Joan like a tidal wave. 6 months, for half a year. Her husband had been betraying her while she cooked him dinner, folded his laundry, and shared a bed with him. The betrayal felt personal and devastating, like a knife to the heart. "How could you?" she asked, her voice cracking. "After everything we've been through?" Richard looked at her, his expression pleading. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened. I was feeling lost. And she—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," Joan interrupted, her anger boiling over. "You didn't just happen to betray me. You chose this, Richard, over and over again." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Joan held up her hand. "I don't want to hear your excuses," she said, her voice cold. "You've broken something I don't think we can fix." That morning marked the end of Joan's life as she had known it. Richard moved out shortly after their confrontation, but the scars of his betrayal remained. Joan filed for divorce, a painful process that made her the subject of small-town gossip. People whispered behind her back, speculating about what might have led Richard to stray. Joan quickly realized that her relationships with friends and neighbors had changed. Some offered pitying looks, while others avoided her altogether, unsure of what to say. Even her closest friends seemed awkward, their conversations laced with uncomfortable silences. Tired of the whispers and judgment, Joan withdrew. She stopped attending community events, declined invitations to dinners, and sold the house she had shared with Richard. She moved to a small cottage on the edge of town, seeking solace in solitude. "I avoid people now," she thought as she sat in her garden, the memory of that email still haunting her. "It's easier this way." After Richard left, Joan Harper found herself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. Her life, once filled with purpose and companionship, now felt hollow. Days bled into nights as she replayed Richard's confession in her mind. 6 months, she thought bitterly. 6 months of lies while I believed everything was fine. Her solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a prison. The cheerful rhythm of her days, grocery runs, coffee with friends, and chats with neighbors, was gone. In its place was a suffocating silence that reminded her of what she had lost. Small towns have long memories, and word of Joan and Richard's separation spread quickly. At first, Joan avoided public spaces entirely, too humiliated to face the inevitable whispers. When she did venture out, she felt the weight of people's stares. "Poor Joan," she overheard someone say at the grocery store. "I heard her husband left her for a younger woman." "That's not what I heard," another voice replied. "Maybe she wasn't the wife he needed." Joan's hands trembled as she abandoned her cart and left the store. Their words echoed in her mind, feeding her self-doubt. She had been a good wife, hadn't she? She cooked his meals, supported his career, cared for their home. What more could he have wanted? What hurt most wasn't the whispers from strangers, but the distance growing between her and her friends. Joan had always been the one to organize gatherings, the one people turned to for advice or a comforting shoulder. But now, those same friends seemed uncomfortable around her. Her closest friend, Diane, was the first to pull away. "Joan," Diane said one day over coffee, "maybe it's time you stopped dwelling on this. Richard's moved on, and I think you should too." Joan stared at her friend, stunned. "Do you think I haven't tried? It's not that easy." Diane sighed, glancing at her watch. "I just don't know what else to say anymore." That was the last time Diane invited Joan over. Feeling abandoned and judged, Joan retreated further into herself. She stopped attending community events, stopped answering calls, and even stopped visiting her children as often. Laura and Ben tried to help, but their lives were busy, and Joan didn't want to burden them with her pain. Instead, she poured herself into her routines, gardening, tidying her cottage, and reading. But even the comfort of her favorite novels couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered, "You're alone because you weren't enough." One rainy afternoon, Joan sat by the window, staring at the drops streaking the glass. Her tea sat untouched on the table, the steam long since faded. for the first time. She allowed herself to ask the questions she had been avoiding. Who am I without Richard? Without the roles I've spent my life playing? Wife? Mother? Friend? What's left of me now? The questions were terrifying, but they also stirred something within her. Joan realized she had spent so much of her life caring for others that she had forgotten how to care for herself. Somewhere along the way, her dreams, passions, and sense of identity had been buried under the weight of responsibility. A week later, Joan ventured out to the park for a walk. The crisp air and golden autumn leaves offered a rare moment of peace. As she rounded a bend, she spotted Linda, an acquaintance she hadn't seen since the divorce. Linda waved and approached her with a warm smile. "Joan, it's so good to see you," Linda said. "How have you been?" Joan hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I've been managing," she said finally. Linda nodded, her expression kind. "I've missed seeing you around. You know, you don't have to go through this alone." Joan's eyes filled with tears. "It's hard. Linda, everyone seems to think I should just move on, but they don't understand how it feels." Linda placed a comforting hand on her arm. "I can't pretend to know exactly what you're going through, but I do know this. You're stronger than you think. And if you ever want to talk, or just get out of the house, I'm here." For the first time in months, Joan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. Inspired by Linda's words, Joan decided to take a small step toward reclaiming her life. She dusted off her old easel and paints, tools she hadn't touched in years. Painting had once been her passion, a way to express herself. But she had given it up long ago, convinced she didn't have the time. At first, her hands trembled as she applied the paint, the strokes uneven and hesitant. But as the colors blended on the canvas, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just painting a landscape, she was painting her emotions, her pain, and her hope. By the time she finished, Joan stood back and studied her work. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, a reflection of the woman she was beginning to rediscover. That evening, Joan sat in her small kitchen, sipping tea and gazing at her painting. She thought about Linda's encouragement, about the strength it had taken to pick up the brush. For the first time since the divorce, she felt a spark of determination. "I may have lost a part of myself," she thought, "but I'm still here, and I'm not giving up." Joan decided that while her journey wouldn't be easy, she wouldn't let Richard's betrayal or the judgment of others define her. She would find her way back, not to the life she had before, but to a new life, one built on her own terms. Joan Harper sat before her easel, the familiar scent of paint filling the air. It had been weeks since she'd picked up a brush, but now, painting had become a daily ritual. Each stroke of color was a small act of defiance against the doubts and pain that had threatened to consume her. Her first works were raw and chaotic, reflecting the storm of emotions she carried inside. But as the days passed, her pieces began to shift. Vivid landscapes, soft sunrises, and quiet moments captured in her unique style. Joan found herself lost in the process, her mind quiet for the first time in months. One morning, her daughter Laura visited unexpectedly and found Joan painting. Laura's eyes lit up as she examined the vibrant canvas. "Mom, this is amazing," she said. "I had no idea you were this talented." Joan smiled shyly. "It's something I used to love, before life got in the way." Laura studied her mother with a newfound admiration. "You should show these to people. They're too beautiful to keep hidden." Encouraged by Laura's words, Joan decided to take a bold step. She joined a local art class at the community center, a decision that filled her with both excitement and anxiety. Walking into the room of strangers, Joan felt a pang of insecurity. Would they see her as the woman who had been abandoned? Would they pity her? But as the instructor, a cheerful woman named Marianne greeted her warmly. Joan's nerves began to settle. The class was a mix of people, from retirees like herself to young professionals seeking a creative outlet. As the weeks passed, Joan found camaraderie among them, their shared passion for art bridging the gaps between their lives. For the first time in years, Joan felt like part of something bigger. She wasn't just Richard's ex-wife or the woman whose husband cheated. She was Joan, an artist, a friend, and a woman rediscovering her own strength. Despite her progress, Joan knew she couldn't fully move forward without confronting the parts of her past that still haunted her. Richard had sent her a few emails over the months, apologizing and asking for forgiveness. She had ignored them, unsure if she was ready to engage. One day, after a particularly fulfilling art class, Joan opened her inbox and reread Richard's messages. They were filled with regret, but also excuses. His loneliness, his feelings of stagnation, his insistence that the affair meant nothing. Joan's heart ached as she typed her response. Richard, I appreciate your apologies, but forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's about letting go. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, and I may never be, but I hope you can find peace with yourself, just as I'm learning to find peace in my own life. As she hit send, Joan felt a weight lift. It wasn't closure, but it was a step. Joan's newfound confidence extended beyond her art. She began reconnecting with old friends, inviting them for tea or attending community events she had once avoided. Though some interactions were awkward, she found that many people welcomed her return with open arms. One friend, Linda, became a constant presence in her life. Over dinners and long walks, Linda offered wisdom and encouragement, reminding Joan that she was capable of creating a fulfilling life on her own. You've always been strong, Linda said one evening. You just forgot for a little while. Joan nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you for reminding me. Word of Joan's artistic talent began to spread, thanks to her classmates and Laura's enthusiastic social media posts. One day, Marianne approached her with an unexpected proposal, an opportunity to display her work in a local gallery's community exhibit. Joan's first reaction was to decline. I'm not ready for something like that, she said, shaking her head. But Marianne smiled. Your work is beautiful, Joan. It deserves to be seen. And I think you're more ready than you realize. After days of hesitation, Joan agreed. Preparing for the exhibit was both thrilling and terrifying. She spent hours refining her pieces, each one a reflection of her journey, pain, resilience, and hope. The gallery buzzed with chatter as Joan entered, her heart pounding. Her paintings hung alongside those of other local artists, each one labeled with her name. She saw familiar faces in the crowd, Laura, Ben, Linda, and even a few neighbors who had once avoided her after the divorce. As Joan mingled, she overheard snippets of conversations about her work. This one feels so raw and emotional, a woman said, pointing to a stormy seascape. And this one, another added, gesturing to a vibrant sunrise. It's like a symbol of hope. Joan felt tears prick her eyes. Her art had touched people in ways she hadn't anticipated. When Laura hugged her tightly and whispered, I'm so proud of you, Mom. Joan knew she had taken another step toward healing. That night, as Joan sat alone in her cottage, she reflected on how far she had come. The woman who had once hidden from the world was now stepping into it with courage and purpose. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, a mosaic of pain and growth, beauty and strength. Joan realized she didn't need to avoid people anymore. She had faced their whispers, their pity, and their judgment, and she had emerged stronger. Most importantly, she had rediscovered the person she was beneath it all, a woman of resilience, creativity, and quiet power. The success of Joan Harper's art exhibit marked a turning point in her life. For the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Painting had started as a way to cope with her emotions, but it had grown into a passion that gave her identity beyond the confines of her past. The positive feedback from the exhibit fueled her confidence, and she began taking bolder steps. Joan enrolled in advanced art workshops and volunteered at the community center to teach basic painting classes. Sharing her skills and encouraging others became a source of joy she hadn't anticipated. During one class, a young woman named Emily approached her with a timid smile. "Ms. Harper," she said, holding up her canvas. "I've never painted before, but I think this might be something I love." Joan smiled warmly. "It's not about being perfect," she said. "It's about expressing what's inside. Keep going. Emily, you're doing beautifully." For Joan, moments like these reminded her that life's greatest rewards often come from helping others find their path. Joan's relationship with her children, Laura and Ben, had always been strong, but the divorce had created a distance she struggled to bridge. Both had been supportive in their own ways, but Joan had avoided leaning on them, not wanting to burden them with her pain. One weekend, Laura invited Joan to stay with her family for a few days, hesitant but longing for connection. Joan accepted, sitting at the dinner table with Laura, her husband, and their children. Joan felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. "Grandma, look what I drew," her granddaughter Ella exclaimed, holding up a colorful crayon masterpiece. Joan's heart swelled as she examined the picture. "This is beautiful. Ella, you've got an artist's eye." Laura watched the interaction with a smile. Later that evening, as they sipped tea together, she said, "Mom, I'm so glad you came. I've missed having you around." Joan reached for her daughter's hand. "I've missed this too. I think I'm ready to be part of life again." One afternoon, while browsing a local farmer's market, Joan ran into a familiar face, Thomas, a widower she had met briefly during her librarian days. They struck up a conversation, reminiscing about the past and sharing updates about their lives. "I heard about your exhibit," Thomas said. "I didn't get a chance to attend, but I've seen some of your work. It's incredible." Joan felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. It's been a journey, to say the least." Thomas smiled. "Well, it's inspiring. Would you like to grab a coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about it." Joan hesitated. It had been so long since she'd considered anything resembling companionship. But there was something kind and genuine about Thomas that put her at ease. "Sure," she said finally. "I think I'd like that." As Joan's world expanded, she learned to balance her newfound pursuits with moments of quiet reflection. She still valued her solitude. It was where she processed her emotions and found clarity. But now, her solitude felt like a choice rather than an escape. Her art continued to evolve, reflecting her inner growth. One of her most recent pieces, a sprawling landscape of a sunrise over a meadow, became her favorite. To her, it symbolized not just hope, but also the beauty of starting anew. She began journaling regularly, capturing her thoughts and feelings as she navigated this new chapter. In one entry, she wrote, "I never thought I could rebuild after losing so much, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. I've found pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. I found joy again." One evening, Joan received a letter from Richard. The sight of his handwriting made her heart race. For a moment, she considered tossing it into the trash, but curiosity won out. She opened it and began to read. In the letter, Richard apologized once again, expressing regret for the pain he had caused. He admitted that his affair had been a mistake born out of his own insecurities, not a reflection of anything Joan had done. He wished her happiness and thanked her for the years they had shared. Joan folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't feel the need to respond. The closure she sought wasn't in Richard's words, but in the life she was building for herself. Weeks later, Joan attended an art fair with some of her students, proudly showcasing their work. As she wandered through the booths, she found herself smiling at the laughter and excitement around her. For so long, she had avoided crowds, but now she felt at home among them. She spotted Thomas near a food stand, waving her over. "What do you think of the fair?" he asked, handing her a cup of cider. "It's wonderful," Joan said, her voice light. "I'm glad I came." As they walked together, Joan realized that her life had come full circle. She hadn't just survived Richard's betrayal. She had thrived in its aftermath. She had found new passions, strengthened her relationships, and opened herself to new possibilities. At 65, Joan Harper wasn't just avoiding people anymore. She was embracing life on her terms. Joan Harper's coffee date with Thomas turned into a series of casual outings. They met at the park for walks, visited local art fairs, and occasionally shared meals at a quiet diner in town. Thomas was kind, patient, and thoughtful, qualities that Joan hadn't realized how much she missed in her life. One afternoon, as they sat by the lake, Thomas said, "You know, Joan, I think you're remarkable. What you've been through and the way you've rebuilt your life, it's inspiring." Joan smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "I'm not sure I'd call it remarkable," she replied. "But I've learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself again." Their connection was steady and unhurried, allowing Joan to savor each moment without the pressure of defining their relationship. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe opening her heart again. Joan's art continued to gain recognition, and she was invited to participate in a larger exhibit at a nearby city gallery. The opportunity was both exciting and nerve-wracking, but Thomas and her children encouraged her to accept. On the night of the exhibit, Joan stood in the gallery, surrounded by her paintings and a crowd of admirers. She wore a soft blue dress that Laura had helped her pick out, feeling both nervous and proud. Each piece told a story of her journey, her heartbreak, her resilience, and her newfound hope. Thomas arrived late, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "These are for the star of the show," he said, handing them to Joan. Joan laughed, accepting the flowers. "I think you're overselling me." "Not a chance," Thomas replied with a grin. The night was a triumph, and as Joan stood before her final piece, a painting of a sunrise breaking through storm clouds, she felt a sense of closure. She had transformed her pain into something beautiful, and now she was sharing it with the world. With her confidence growing, Joan began to take more risks. She signed up for a creative writing workshop, fulfilling a dream she had long put aside. She also started traveling, visiting nearby towns and exploring places she had never made time for before. Thomas often joined her on these adventures, and their bond deepened with each shared experience. One afternoon, as they hiked along a forest trail, he turned to her and said, "Joan, you make me believe in second chances." Joan looked at him, her eyes soft with emotion. "You make me believe in them too." One evening, while organizing old papers, Joan came across the letter Richard had sent her. She read it again, this time with a calmer heart. The anger and hurt had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Joan sat down and wrote her own letter, not to Richard, but to herself. "Dear Joan, you've come so far. You've endured pain, betrayal, and loneliness. But you never gave up on yourself. You found strength in the darkest moments. And you've built a life full of beauty and purpose. You are more than what happened to you. You are whole, and you are enough." She folded the letter and placed it in her journal, a symbol of the peace she had finally found. On her 66th birthday, Joan hosted a small gathering at her cottage. It was her first time inviting a group of friends and family over since her divorce, and the house was filled with laughter and warmth. Laura and Ben presented her with a scrapbook filled with photos of her art, her adventures, and candid moments they had captured. "This is your story, Mom," Laura said, "and we're so proud of you." Joan's heart swelled with gratitude as she hugged her children. Looking around the room, she saw Linda chatting with Thomas, her neighbors sharing stories, and her grandchildren playing in the yard. It was a moment of pure joy, a reminder of how far she had come. As the party wound down, Joan stood on her porch, watching the stars. Thomas joined her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Joan smiled, her gaze fixed on the sky. "I'm thinking about how life doesn't always go the way we plan, but sometimes that's a good thing." Thomas nodded. "Here's to the next chapter, then." Joan turned to him, her heart full. "Here's to whatever comes next." At 66, Joan Harper had reclaimed her life, transforming her pain into strength and her solitude into self-discovery. She had learned that it's never too late to start over, to find love, and to embrace the beauty of life on her own terms.